Welcome to the program. Gary Gallagher is one of the nation's most preeminent Civil War historians. He is at the University of Virginia and the executive director of the Now Center on the Civil War. His most recent book is The American War. Gary, thank you so much for being here.
Great to be here.
Really been looking forward to this. I have so much I want to ask you about, but let's start with the statues. Charlottesville, Virginia has made national news because two of its city councilors have come forward and publicly said they want that Robert E. Lee statue over in Lee Park to come down.
Right.
Some are saying it needs to be destroyed. Some are saying it should go into a museum. But everyone in that conversation, at least that was standing up there with them, was saying, hey, this is a 21st century progressive city. We have no place anymore for statues that celebrate the U.S. Confederacy.
Right.
From your perspective, decades, a career studying the Civil War.
I'm really old, yes. Let me bring all my experience to this.
Gary, how do we make sense of this? I mean,
Well,
give us some context.
I will give you some context. This is something that comes up periodically in different places. It's essentially the same argument on each side, both those who want to preserve the statues from a kind of neo-Confederate perspective and those who say it's time to take these down. They represent a slave-holding republic, and why are they still here? They're an affront to where we are now. I take a position that we should not, I don't believe in destroying parts of our memorial landscape. I believe in interpreting them. I think that it's very important to provide context for something like the Lee statue, which went up in 1924 and in some ways doesn't have much to do with the Confederacy and has everything to do with 1924.
Right.
I would say put up further interpretation in Lee Park and rename it something else if you want to, the park, that provides visitors with a context for why the statue went up, when it went up, and so forth. I think taking these down actually is potentially very damaging to a real understanding of our past. I think we have to engage our past, warts and all, and I think it's a mistake to begin sanitizing the past by taking things down, such as Confederate statues. I think there are lots of other things that could be taken down as well. I just think it's better to put them in context, leave them there, and give us the ability, in looking at a memorial context, to really trace different themes and movements and times in American history.
Because history changes, right, Gary? I mean, the way we talk about the past changes through time.
Absolutely. But one of the main things I try to get my students to understand is that there's a difference between history and memory. Something does actually happen, but the ways in which we remember it, interpret it, use it, change constantly. And it's those different memories that often manifest themselves in the different parts of the memorial landscape. And I think that's another reason why we need to leave the landscape intact, to chart those changes, which will reveal a great many things about our past. Some of them uncomfortable.
And speaking of uncomfortable, I know you well enough to know that you're very sensitive to some of the views that are out there of people of color who say, look, when I bring my kids downtown Charlottesville and I walk past this statue, I feel like a Jew in Germany looking at a statue of Hitler that's still up. Why should I have to endure this in my own hometown?
I do understand those arguments, and that's the position that many of my friends hold. It's a position that I disagree with for the reasons that I've given. I think that it's important to leave the memorial landscape intact, even if history does make people uncomfortable. That's another thing I tell my students. If you're looking for a past that doesn't make you uncomfortable sometimes, you better go somewhere else, because you're not going to find it here. There are many elements of our past that leave us uncomfortable, many elements that are sort of, they can make us feel very good, they can lift our spirits, but there are many troubled parts of the history of the United States, and I think we need to deal with them, confront them, put them in context, if we're going to get a good sense of our overall history. And this memorial landscape is part of that, as far as I'm concerned.
I am reminded of sort of this national, I don't want to call it a movement, but it's a dynamic that we're certainly seeing at colleges and universities around the country where faculty they don't want to offend their students.
Right.
We're seeing that in the public square as well. We don't want to offend people when, as you say, hey, the past is going to offend you. Art will offend you. Art about the past will offend you.
Life is going to offend you. If a student, and I'll be serious here, I think we do a disservice to students to try to shave all the hard edges of life off for them and insulate them against ever being offended, because once they leave our little academic cocoon, I promise you they're going to be offended, and maybe offended on a regular basis. You need to learn to deal with that, I think. And in my world, in the academic world, I think we've gone a very long way to try to avoid any kind of discomfort on the part of students, and I don't think that serves them well. I really don't.
Yeah. Now, you have taken students to look at these statues,
I give
right?
lost cause tours of Charlottesville, Virginia, and I use the statues in the University Cemetery, the one in front of the courthouse, the Jackson statue, the Lee statue, and the bronze tablets that list all the dead Confederate soldiers who'd gone to UVA. So I have 5 stops on my lost cause tour of Charlottesville, Virginia, and I think they're very effective props for me to use. It's a way in which material culture can really help a teacher.
Yeah.
And I can trace them from how different meanings evolved from 1893 when the first one went up to 1924 when Lee went up. They're not all just the same, these 5 statues. They're not all the same. They have different meanings, they're at different times, and they can be used differently by someone who's trying to explain how these contested views of the American Civil War played out over a period of now more than a century and a half.
Now, let me ask you about that, because you mentioned contested views, you mentioned the lost cause. I was speaking to a class the other day, and when I asked how many had ever heard of the lost cause, not one hand went up, Gary.
That's too bad.
It is
That's
too
why
bad.
we need to leave the Lee statue up in part. So the interpretation there could help them understand that is one of there are 4 main memory streams that came out of the generation that fought the Civil War. One is the Union cause theme, which argued the most important thing was that the nation had been put together. One's the emancipation cause theme that was happy the Union was put together, but said the best thing that happened was that the institution of slavery was finally gotten rid of. A third one was the lost cause memory of the war, which is the ex-Confederate memory of the war, which changed history by saying slavery wasn't really important to the establishment of the Confederacy.
Just about states' rights.
States' rights. And you can argue that as long as you don't read anything, but there you go. And argued that the Confederacy never could have won. Never could have won. It was a hopeless cause fought for high constitutional principles, which sort of lets you hold your head up in the wake of a shattering defeat. A fourth memory stream was what historians call the reconciliation cause, which involved some white Northerners and white Southerners saying, well, no, let's don't talk about who was right or wrong, let's just talk about the great country that came out of this. So there are very different ways to remember the war on the part of that wartime generation, all of which continue to have resonance in some way or another now.
Yeah. And the hope would be, I don't want to speak for you, but the hope would be that we could put that kind of awareness, that experience in a public park. I mean, why not in a public park?
That's my hope, yes. And yes, absolutely. There are museums. You say that some people argue for putting these in museums. Well, fewer and fewer people are going to museums.
Yeah.
I'm not sure fewer and fewer people are going to parks. I just think that the outdoor, I'm repeating myself, the outdoor memorial landscape intact is a wonderful way for us to teach important lessons about United States history.
And just in terms, I don't want you to design it for us on the spot, but just in terms of nuts and bolts, we're talking about additional signage, maybe even more statues that could be in conversation with Lee.
Yes. Turn that into a park that deals with Jim Crow, deals with the movement from emancipation to Jim Crow. Do that in Lee Park and rename it something else. But Lee's presence there would give greater power to that kind of interpretation, in my view. That's a part of this. That's a tangible reminder of what the Jim Crow South was doing in the way of creating a memorial landscape.
Right. They were putting up statues to venerate and honor the Confederacy.
Right. Absolutely.
And as a way of saying to people of color, hey, you're not welcome here.
That's right.
You're not among those who have power in our
community. You're not the ones putting up statues. We're the ones putting up statues.
Right.
So if you get a different kind of statues in the second decade of the 21st century, that's a great teaching tool as well. Here we were in the 1920s, here we are now.
Yeah.
So let's talk about how we got from there to here.
So instead of the park and those statues becoming objects of celebration, it becomes a window to really explore the realities of the past, the horrific realities of the past.
I believe that is one way they can be very useful, yes.
Yeah. Gary, let's take a quick break. And when we get back, I want to talk more about the Civil War and some recent scholarship, things that are going on. You're watching the Coy Barefoot Program. I'm Coy Barefoot, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the program. We're talking with Gary Gallagher, one of the nation's preeminent Civil War historians. He's at the University of Virginia. His most recent book is The American War. Gary, we were talking during the break about some of these statues and how, what's happening in Charlottesville is happening throughout the American South.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's happened. When I was a graduate student at the University of Texas, there was a movement. People discover these statues, anew periodically, and there's a part of the campus there that has a number of Confederate statues. And this is in the late 1970s and early 1980s. There was a movement to take those down. Texas, the University of Texas recently took down Jefferson Davis and Woodrow Wilson, who were among Wilson, obviously not a Civil War person, but they left Robert E. Lee, Albert Sidney Johnston, and John Reagan up. Their 3 Confederates stayed and 1 Confederate went. I'm not quite sure how they parsed that, other than aesthetically maybe, but it's this kind of movement, the discovery of these statues and efforts to remove them, something that goes in rhythms, and it comes up in New Orleans. The City Council voted a few months ago to take down their Confederate statues, including a very large one that has Lee at the top of it.
Yeah. That you wonder what museum's going to...
Well, that one can't fit in a museum.
It won't even fit in a museum. Right. And some of these statues here in Charlottesville they're just massive. These huge equestrian statues are just, I mean, it would cost millions of dollars.
Would probably be expensive.
Right. Gary, let me ask you about, let's pull the camera back here metaphorically, and I want to ask you about scholarship on the Civil War. Where are we now in the work on the Civil War, in our understanding about that period, including Reconstruction, which you've written about recently? And take a moment to reflect on how you've seen that change as a scholar and as a student of this period of the American story.
It's changed dramatically. And your first question, where are we now? We're at the very best time that has ever existed in terms of scholarship on the Civil War. The most wide-ranging scholarship looking at the broadest array of topics. There is a part of the literature that's looking at the environment in the war. There's a pretty large emerging literature that's looking at the impact of the war on veterans, that is talking about veterans who were badly damaged during the war. That's been the focus of a good deal of this. I think we're needing more work on the veterans who weren't particularly damaged, but we're moving, instead of what happened to the soldiers during the war, there's a good deal of attention now to what happened to them after the war. There's been a great deal of work on the process of emancipation. That began a long time ago, but that continues and is very fruitful. It will be interesting to me to see what the sesquicentennial of Reconstruction brings in the way of new attention toward the 12 years of Reconstruction. That remains to be seen.
Yeah. What is it about Reconstruction, that period of Reconstruction when Union soldiers occupied southern states, southern cities, and were controlled? What is it about that period you think that most Americans today don't know or don't
Everything.
get?
I think they know almost nothing about Reconstruction, and I think too many of them still have some vague notion of the old view of Reconstruction as a time when the power of the central government held the white South under its jack-booted heel for 12 years. In fact, there never was what we would call a real occupation of the former Confederacy because the Army wasn't big enough to do that. The United States Army went from 1 million men, that's a volunteer army, in May of 1865. 15 months later or so, you're down to an army of about 60,000 men. And many of those are deployed in the West, of course. By the early 1870s, the U.S. Army had fewer than 30,000 men in it. Reconstruction is still going on.
Wow.
Most of those men are deployed to the West. The former Confederacy is huge, so the notion that there's a real occupation of the former Confederacy is just wrong.
It's
the
a
Gone
myth.
with the Wind view, the Birth of a Nation view, no, it just isn't true.
So that is actually part of the lost cause.
Yes, that's
the
very
lost cause
important.
myth.
Very
Yeah.
important to the lost cause. To pretend that there's this awful, repressive military occupation.
Carpetbaggers everywhere. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And what they would have called Negro rule, where the legislatures were taken over by black legislators, and there was this sort of corrupt bargain between white Yankees and Southern black people, and they held the former Confederates under their thumb. That's the what was for a very long time the best known understanding of Reconstruction.
Yeah.
And I think it still lingers to a troubling degree.
Yeah. Speaking of still lingering, I was struck, Gary, by that when they had that press conference in Lee Park, and you had the men and women out there waving the Confederate flags, and they were yelling, you can't change history, you don't understand Lee. So much of the sentiment, Gary, seemed to be about protecting Lee,
Right.
protecting this idea of Lee, of the legacy of the Confederacy, which of course, comes right out of the Lost Cause.
It
but
does.
I was struck by how much that is still so palpable in the 21st century.
It's palpable. I think it's not palpable among as large a group of people as many think, because every time you see a protest, there are the Confederate flags, usually called the Stars and Bars. That flag is not the Stars and Bars. It's the St. Andrew's Cross battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia. That's the most famous Confederate symbol. What they can't fix is the fact that that flag is inextricably linked to every group of Ku Klux Klan people who ever gather, it's just, they want to disassociate that from white supremacy and slavery, and they just need to stop trying to do that, because it cannot be disassociated from that. It's the most obvious symbol of an effort to establish a slaveholding republic, and then a symbol that was used most often by the defeated people who failed to do that when they tried to regain control of Southern society. And by regain, I mean reestablish white supremacy in the former Confederate states. You cannot fix the Confederate flag in that regard. So they need to just stop trying to fix it.
Yeah. What is it about Lee, you think? Because we see these people saying, you don't understand Lee. He didn't really like slavery. He didn't want to fight the Civil War.
Yeah. It's common to say Lee was against slavery. There's one statement that people use to prove that. He wrote a letter in 1856 where he said that slavery was wrong. People quote that. They don't quote the rest of the letter. He said slavery's wrong, but we shouldn't do anything about it, that God will get rid of it in time. Lee had
sort of the Jefferson approach. Yeah.
He had very conventional views for a white Southerner of his class, which was aristocratic. A huge slaveholding in his family, of course, not he himself, but his family. If you really want to know what Lee thought about slavery, read his response to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which Lee responded to about a week later in January 1863. He is livid about this, absolutely beside himself with anger about the Emancipation Proclamation.
Wow. But we don't hear that in the park when the people are screaming and waving the flag.
No, you don't, and you won't. But that could be, anyway, you don't.
Yeah. So, Gary, is there a moment, you think, in the Civil War that you look at as particularly instructive, that provides us, is there any one moment, person, or scene that you like to return to when you talk about the Civil War? And I know there's many you can talk about.
There are many.
Yeah.
I mean, there are moments that I use for different purposes.
Right.
Lee, part of this thing about Lee, Lee was essential to the Lost Cause because he is the best card former Confederates can play. You can talk about him without talking about slavery. You can't talk about Jefferson Davis without talking about slavery, but you can talk about Lee. They argued that the United States had overwhelming numbers and resources. Lee's army was always outnumbered, yet Lee won victories, some very famous victories, so you can portray him. He was a reluctant secessionist. He did oppose secession, but then he became an ardent Confederate. So you can tell part of the story in many ways and create a version of Lee that you heard at Lee Park. But if you look at the whole person, Lee, you get a radically different view than that. He's a very good example of someone. There are key moments in the war where you can sort of tease out why he was so important, why there was such a bond between the Confederate people and him. I mean, there are literally places on a couple of battlefields where there were these spontaneous outpourings of emotion on the part of his men directed toward Lee, and that helps explain the long relationship between Confederates and former Confederates and Lee, and why he's so important to them.
He became, certainly by the 1920s, when the Lee statue goes up in Charlottesville, he was the symbol.
Well, what else happened in the 1920s? His home was made a national shrine that the National Park Service now runs. It isn't just Lee Park in Charlottesville, Virginia. Arlington became a national shrine at roughly the same time that statue went up in Lee Park. So the Lee phenomenon has a national dimension far beyond the borders of the old country. He's been on 5 United States postage stamps. How many other rebel leaders in world history have been on 5 postage stamps issued by the nation? They did more to try to dismember than anyone else.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. It's memory. It's the ways that memory work are fascinating.
What can you point to today that gives you real hope that these lessons, this knowledge, this collective knowledge that we have, thanks to fantastic historians like yourself, this knowledge that we have about the past, about the Civil War, about Reconstruction, about Jim Crow, what gives you hope that knowledge will be shared with more and more people, that it's not going to be lost to the dustbins of history, that we'll still be teaching our children these really important lessons, so that they know, I know it's a long question, but so that they know in the future things like this are possible.
Right.
This can really happen. People can use, in the South, the Confederacy, they can use their religious faith to rationalize some of the most unspeakable horrors committed against other human beings.
Yep. I mean, what gives me faith, and I'm in a sort of a singular job category in that regard, is I get to deal with young people all the time, and I see ideas and notions change in my classes. Students come in thinking something, then they read things, we discuss things, we use films and other things to work through different versions of the Civil War that have come down. They actually change their minds, broaden their views, go out, talk to their parents, they all have an uncle who knows everything about the Civil War and says it's all about state rights. Well, they go tell their uncle maybe it's not all about state rights. I see hope in that regard. I don't labor under the illusion that historians are as influential as one movie, however. I mean, most people, far more people, see the worst dreck that comes out of Hollywood than read all our books put together. So in a sense, we're trying to undo damage, celluloid damage sometimes.
Well, very well put. And that must just frustrate the heck out of you to see a Hollywood movie
that gets
everything wrong.
Yeah. But it's dramatic and people like it.
Right. And hopefully it'll interest a young person saying, hey, I want to learn more about this.
But they can be teaching the film Lincoln. Daniel Day-Lewis, I think, is a splendid Lincoln. I don't know what actor would ever take on that role again, because Daniel Day-Lewis is really good. I enjoyed the film. I think there are interpretive things about it that are very wrong, but it's a great teaching tool. And films are a wonderful way to help students understand both how we get our knowledge of the past, and it's often from Hollywood, not from books, but also how interpretations of the past change.
Yeah, and that's certainly one of the challenges that we face moving forward with younger people. I have a 14-year-old daughter who's always on Instagram.
Always.
It's just one little image after another.
That's right.
And I'm like, here, let's read a book.
A whole book.
Are there any pictures in it?
No, it's hard. It actually is harder. I think that it's more difficult. I've been teaching about 35 years. It really is more difficult to get students to read entire books now than it was once upon a time. They're just not conditioned to do that to the same degree that they once were. Not that everybody always was. But I think in a world where we do text and but all of these other ways, that sound bites, short things, I just think we're conditioned to do the multitasking illusion. You know, I can do 4 things at once. Yes, you can do 4 things poorly at once.
Right.
How about taking time and doing one thing well? Anyway.
Yeah, and that critical thinking that a place like the University of Virginia seeks to impart on its students. And it's a two-way process, because as you and I both know, the teacher also walks away from every class with a new understanding and new enlightenment.
Yes.
That critical thinking hopefully will continue to be applied towards the past, the Civil War, Reconstruction.
Critical thinking that accepts as the absolute starting point that however complicated they might think something was before they start to look at it, they're going to find out that it was far more complicated.
Far more complicated.
Far more. And if what their goal is to get to a very simple formulation of the past, then don't take a history class. Because any good history class is going to widen your lens, not narrow your lens in that regard.
And the people who say, let's destroy these statues, the people who wave the flag and say, let's keep them and celebrate them, both of those are overly simplistic. Yeah.
I think they are, yes. I'm speaking only for myself, but yes, I do.
Yeah. Gary, thank you for being here, and thank you so much for the work
Thanks for the
that you
invitation.
do. I appreciate it. Gary Gallagher is at the University of Virginia, where he is the executive director of the Nall Center on the Civil War. His most recent book is The American War. I'm Coy Barefoot. Have a terrific week, and y'all be good to each other.